I've got a spare room. You don't have to earn it first. Between them on the table sat every gray wool blanket the mercantile had left, 12 of them, stacked and paid for. And her hands beside the pile split open at the knuckles from the axe. By every account in Marrow's Bend, Judith Osborne should have sold out by the first hard freeze and taken the mail coach east to whatever family would still claim her. Instead, she was up at 4 every morning, splitting and hauling her own firewood in the dark so no one in town would ever watch her ask for help. She was 34 years old, a widow with her late husband's horse ranch and 40 head of stock she could not afford to feed through a bad spring. The bank held paper on her water. The county recorder had her legitimate filing sitting in a drawer, not refused, simply not yet recorded, and every day it stayed. There was a day the dry creek bed on her east line belonged a little less to her. If this kind of story is why you are here, stay with me to the end of it, because the way it turns is worth the wait. Tell me where you are listening from tonight. I like knowing who is out there in the quiet with me. Angus Broderick had lived 9 miles west of her for 4 years and had never once come to her door. 33 years old, hat on, bearded, a man who paid cash and kept his fences up and did not sit down to dinner in other people's houses. The town read him as unfriendly. The town was wrong, though it would take most of a winter and a public reckoning for anyone to learn it, and there were parts of his life the whole county had only seen the edges of. So why would a man like that, a man who had spent his adult life keeping careful daylight between himself and everyone else, walk into a mercantile in a snowstorm and buy every blanket on the shelf for a woman who had not asked him for anything? And what was she really afraid of? It was not the cold, and it was not the bank. Just the moment somebody finally looked at her ledgers, her cracked hands, her empty house, and decided out loud what she was worth. She had a secret of her own, 2 seasons of it, tapped out in code on a telegraph key, back when her family still had money. Nobody in Marrow's Bend knew that yet. 11 months before the snowstorm, before the blankets, before anyone in Marrow's Bend had cause to say her name in a courthouse, Judith Osborne was standing in her own yard at 4 a.m. with an axe in her hands. Dark that time of year came down like a lid. She worked by feel and by the little gray suggestion of light off the frost. Set the round on the block, find the check in the grain with her thumb, swing. The sound carried farther than she liked. That was the one thing she could not fix. A splitting axe in cold air rings out across open country like somebody knocking on a door, and she was 9 miles from her nearest neighbor, and still it seemed to her that the whole county could hear a woman doing a man's chore in the dark. Which was, of course, the reason she did it in the dark. She had it figured to the minute. 2 hours of splitting, 1 hour of hauling, the ricks laid up along the north wall of the house where the wind stripped them dry. By the time the sun came up over the flat, the work was done and gone, and there was nothing left for anyone to see but a tidy stack and a woman with her hair pinned and her cuffs buttoned. If a rider came through at 8 a.m, he found a ranch that appeared to be managing. Her knuckles were split open across the backs of both hands, cracked in the cold, opened again with every swing, healing over at night into thin white seams that broke the moment she picked up the handle. She kept them in her sleeves at church. She was 34 years old. In Marrow's Bend, that was not old. In Marrow's Bend, for a woman with no husband, no children, no money coming in, and a dead man's brand on 40 head of stock, it was late. Late is a different thing from old. Old is something you can be gracefully. Late is something people count. Her people had come out of Abilene, and there had been money once, enough that her mother kept a girl to do the wash. Then the grass fire of her 19th year took 4,000 acres. The house, the barns, the fence posts down to char sticks in a row. The only structure standing when the smoke cleared was the chapel, and it was standing the way a burned thing stands, walls up and roof gone, pews facing an altar with nothing over it but sky. She had walked through it 2 days later, ash to the ankle. Hymnals fused shut. She remembered thinking that a building could lose everything that made it a building and still, from a distance, look like a church. She had thought of that chapel more in the last year than in the 15 before it. Her husband had bought this place for the water. That was the whole argument for it. The dry creek bed came down the east line, and it ran only in spring, and it ran hard, and a man with the filing on it could water 200 head where his neighbor watered 30. He had made the filing legitimately. He had also, in the last summer of his life, borrowed against it at the bank, and the note had a way of sitting in her mind at night like a stone in a boot. She had the papers. She had them in a tin box under the floor of the tack room, wrapped in oilcloth, because she was not a fool. On the last Sunday in September, she rode into town with the papers in her lap. Marrow's Bend on a Sunday was a good place to learn exactly what you were worth. She hitched at the rail, and she went up the church steps, and she took a bench 3 rows from the back, and she felt the room adjust around her the way water adjusts around a hand. Nobody was unkind. That would have been easier. The Yarborough women moved their skirts to make room and asked after her stock, and she said the stock was well, and they said, both of them, in the same tone, that it must be so much for one person. That was the whole knife. Must be so much, said with warmth. Said the way you speak to someone whose situation has been discussed at a table you were not sitting at. And in the second pew from the front, in gray, with her gloves folded in her lap, and her chin at an angle that suggested a woman listening closely to the sermon, sat Ida Weatherby. Ida Weatherby was the county recorder, and had been for 6 years, and she was up for reappointment in the spring. She had a memory like a ledger, and a way of asking after your health that felt like a survey being taken. She knew who was behind on a note. She knew it before the note holder did. When Ida Weatherby said she would pray for you, half the town heard it as a public notice. After the service, Judith crossed to the county office with the tin box under her arm, and Ida unlocked the door for her, because Ida was accommodating on a Sunday when the accommodation cost her nothing. Judith laid out the filing, the original, the survey, the marker description off the east line. Ida read it all the way through. She was thorough. That was the thing people got wrong about her. Later, when they tried to say she was careless, she was never careless once in the whole business. This is in order, Ida said. Judith said she believed it was. I'll want to compare it against the book, Ida said. There's a prior description on that creek, and I won't record 2 claims on one water. You wouldn't want me to? No, Judith said. I wouldn't. It won't be long, Ida said, and she set the papers in the second drawer of her desk and closed the drawer with 2 fingers, gently, the way you close a drawer you intend to open soon. It would be 7 months. Judith walked out into the white noon light and stood a moment on the boardwalk and felt something she could not have named yet. Not fear, not suspicion, just the sensation of having handed a thing over. Then she went to the livery because her mare had thrown a shoe on the ride in. The livery in Marrow's Bend was the warmest building in town, and the only one where a person could stand for a while without being spoken to. Emmett Sparrow ran it. He was 60 if he was a day, deaf in the left ear, and he had a policy of never asking a customer a question he could answer himself by looking. Judith liked him for that more than she liked most people for kindness. He had the mare's foot up when she came in. He also had bad news about the harness, which she already knew about, a hame strap worn through at the buckle that would part on her the next time she pulled a full load of wood. New straps $1.40, Emmett said. Judith did the arithmetic she did 40 times a day. $1.40 against feed, against the note, against nails, against coffee. "I'll splice it," she said. "You can't splice that. I've spliced worse." Emmett let it go, being the kind of man who let things go, and she went out to the water trough to wash the ash off her hands and stood there in the sun a minute longer than she needed to. There was a man at the far end of the barn aisle, in the shadow past the third stall, working a curry comb over a big gray gelding. She knew who he was the way everyone knew who he was, which is to say, by elimination. Angus Broderick, 33 years old, 9 miles west of her, 4 years running, and in 4 years he had never once come to her door, never come to a funeral or a barn raising, never sat down at anybody's table. His hat was on. His hat was, by all accounts, always on. He paid cash for everything he bought, and he did not stand around after. He did not look up when she passed. She did not expect him to. She rode home. She split wood at 4 the next morning. She hitched the wagon at 6 to haul it, and when she reached for the harness, she stopped, because the worn hame strap was gone, and a new one was buckled in its place, oiled, stiff, the tongue of the buckle still bright where the leather worker's punch had gone through. There was no note. There was no bill from Emmett, then or ever, and when she went in and asked, Emmett looked at the roof beam and said the strap had been paid for, and that was the end of what he was going to say about it. She stood in her own barn for a while with her hand on that buckle. Here is what she did not let herself feel, standing there. She did not let herself feel relief, because relief was a door, and she had spent a year nailing it shut. Somebody had looked at her outfit and seen the one thing about to break, and had fixed it without asking, and had made sure she would not have to thank anybody for it. $1.40. That was all it was. She hauled the wood. She banked the fire. She went to bed at 8 and lay awake listening to the wind come off the flat, and she thought about the second drawer of Ida Weatherby's desk, closed gently, and about a barn aisle in shadow, and about a man whose face she had not actually seen. Another small thing she noticed, later when she went back over it, he had let her walk past him without once making her account for herself. No question, no pity, just a new strap on the harness. Emmett Sparrow came at it sideways, the way he came at everything. It was the second week of October, and she had ridden in for salt and stayed too long at the livery because it was warm and nobody there wanted anything from her. He was standing at the harness bench with a collar in his lap and both hands full, and he did not look up. "I've got more leather than hands," he said. "Been that way since August. Judith said that was a good problem." "It's a problem," he said. "Good's a stretch." Then he told her, still not looking up, that he paid $1 a day and a bit over for piecework on a Saturday, that a Saturday was his worst day and his busiest, and that if she knew how to set a rivet and cut a billet strap true, he would rather have her than the boy who came Thursdays and put the grain in the wrong bin twice. "I know how to set a rivet," she said. "Then that's settled, and I don't have to think about it," Emmett said, and he set the collar down and went to find a horse that needed nothing, which was his way of leaving a room without leaving it. She stood there and understood exactly what he had done, and she let him do it, because he had built the thing so she could walk in through the front. He had not offered her help. He had complained about his own workload until she solved it for him. That was a kindness dressed up as a business arrangement, and it was the only kind she could have accepted that fall without going home sick. She said yes on a Tuesday. She started that Saturday. The livery at 7 in the morning smelled like hay dust and hoof parings and the cold iron of the forge before it caught. Emmett gave her the bench along the south wall under the window, a box of rivets, a round knife with a good edge, and no instructions at all. By 9, she had rebuilt 2 breechins and put a new keeper on a headstall and her hands were black to the wrist with neatsfoot oil, and the split places across her knuckles had stopped stinging because the oil had gotten into them and sealed them shut. Angus Broderick came in at 9:30. He led the gray gelding down the aisle and put him in the third stall and came back up with a bridle over his shoulder. He set it on the end of her bench. He did not sit down. "Cheek piece is gone at the fold," he said. Judith turned it over. The cheek piece was not gone. It was creased, worn thin on the outside of the bend, the way leather goes when a man has used it hard for years, and it had a season left in it, maybe 2. "I can replace it," she said. "I'd take that," he said. "Be an hour." "I'll wait," he said, and he went and stood at the gray's stall with his forearms on the rail and did not say another word for the whole hour. She built the cheek piece. She matched the skive, punched the holes with the round awl instead of the drive punch because the drive punch tore, and set the buckle so the tongue sat centered. When she was done, she carried it down the aisle to him, and he took it and looked at it the way a man looks at work, turning it to the light at the stall door. Then he reached into his coat and put money into her hand. Coins, counted out already, exact, warm from his pocket. His fingers came down flat against her palm to keep the coins from rolling, and then they were gone. Their hands almost touched. Almost. 60 cents was the price. He paid 80 and did not stay to be argued with. Another small thing she noticed. He had come in with one piece of tack that was not broken, and he had waited an hour in a cold barn for a repair he could have done himself in 20 minutes with a punch and a piece of latigo. The second Saturday he brought 3 things: a halter with a worn crown, a pair of split reins with a scuff at the water loop, a saddlebag whose stitching had let go along 4 inches of the gusset. He set them on the end of the bench in a row, the way a man lays out cards he has no intention of explaining, and said, when he's ready, and went to the gray. She worked through all 3. It took until noon. Emmett came by twice and looked at the row of leather and looked at her and said nothing, which from Emmett was practically a speech. She was paid $2.40, and she took it home in her coat pocket with her hand over it the whole 9 miles. That night she counted what feed $2.40 bought, and it was not much, and it was not nothing, and it was the first money that had come onto that place since June that did not come off the back of a horse she could not afford to sell. By the 3rd Saturday it had a shape. By the 5th it had a name in her own head, though she never said it out loud, not to Emmett, not to anybody. She called it the Saturday. He came at 9:30, always 9:30. He put the gelding in the 3rd stall, always the 3rd, and he brought something with him, and it was always something with life left in it, and she always fixed it, and he always paid over the asking price and left before she could hand any of it back. October went brown and hard. The cottonwoods along the wagon road let go all at once in a 3-day wind, and after that the country had nothing soft in it anywhere. She was still up at 4. Still 2 hours on the block and 1 on the haul, still done and stacked before the light came up over the flat to tell on her. But now there was a Saturday at the end of the week with a bench and a window in it, and she found she was measuring her days against it without permission. The 4th Saturday, Emmett had coffee on the stove. He had never had coffee on the stove before. He put a cup down at her elbow without comment and put a second cup on the top of the grain bin by the aisle, and when Angus came in he saw it there and stopped and looked at it and did not touch it. It went cold. Emmett threw it out at noon and said nothing. The 5th Saturday there were 2 cups again. This time Angus picked his up, standing with his hat on, at the stall door 20 feet away, and drank it looking down the aisle at the horses. The 6th Saturday he drank it leaning against the corner post at the end of her bench, close enough that she could hear him swallow, close enough that when the forge caught, she felt the temperature change on the side of her face, and knew he felt it too. The 7th Saturday he sat down on the grain bin. Nobody remarked on it. There was nothing to remark on. A man sat on a bin in a barn where he was paying for work to be done. She set 9 rivets in a row that morning and did not miscount one. She had not let herself feel this yet, and would not for weeks. He took his coffee black, no sugar, though Emmett kept sugar in a lard tin on the shelf and offered it every time. She knew that about him before she knew where he was from. Another small thing she noticed. He never took his hat off inside, not once, and he never sat with his back to the door. November came in cold and stayed. The first hard freeze came on a Thursday and split the water trough at the seam, and she was up to her elbows in ice water at 5 in the morning, working the ice out in plates so the stock could drink. By Saturday, her hands were in a bad way. The splits across the knuckles had gone deep, and the cold had opened one to the point that she had wrapped it in a strip of flour sacking to keep it from bleeding on the leather. She kept her cuffs down. She kept her hands moving, which is the other way to hide them. He came at 9:30 with a crupper strap that had a nick in it. He set it on the bench. He looked at the bench, not at her the way he always did. Then he set down beside the strap a flat tin, the kind a salve comes in, with the mercantile's label still on the lid and the wax seal unbroken. "Lanolin and tallow," he said. "They put it up for the sheepmen." Judith said nothing at all. "Sheepman told me it beats bear grease," he said. "I wouldn't know." Then he went to the gray gelding and got on with brushing an animal that did not need brushing, and she sat with the tin in front of her for a long moment while the forge ticked and the wind came around the north corner of the barn and worried at the window sash. He had not said, "Your hands are bad," or "Let me see," or that she should not be splitting her own wood, a thing she had been braced to hear from somebody for a solid year, a sentence she had rehearsed 9 different answers to. He had put a tin on a bench and blamed a sheepman. She used it that night. It stung going on, and then it stopped, and in the morning the deep one across the second knuckle of her right hand had closed enough to swing on. She never thanked him for it. He never gave her an opening to, which she came to understand was the whole design. Ida Weatherby's office had a window on the street, and Ida sat where she could see out of it. She saw Judith Osborne's wagon go by on the Saturdays. She saw it come in early and go out at noon, and she noted it because Ida noted things, and she mentioned it on a Tuesday to the young man who came over from the bank every Tuesday with a leather case and a list. "She's taken piecework at the livery," Ida said. "Leather work. $1 a day, more or less." The young man wrote nothing down. That was not the kind of list he carried. "She'll hold out through the winter on it," Ida said, "not through the spring." Then she opened the second drawer of her desk about 4 inches, looked in at what was in it, and closed it again with 2 fingers. The 8th Saturday, snow spat at the window all morning and did not stick. He brought a hame strap. Judith looked at it for a while before she picked it up. It was the mate to the one that had appeared on her own harness in September, cut from the same hide, punched with the same punch, and she knew that the way she knew the coffee. "This one is fine," she said. He said, "The buckle sits crooked." The buckle did not sit crooked. She set it on the bench between them and put her finger on the tongue and turned it so the light caught it and said, "It sits true." Angus Broderick looked at the strap. Then he looked at her, which he had done maybe 4 times in 8 weeks, and she had counted, and the count was accurate. "Then make me a spare," he said. She made him a spare. He paid $1.40 and left it on the bench and walked out, and Emmett Sparrow came up the aisle afterward with a hoof-pick in his hand and said to nobody that a man who kept a spare of everything never had to ask a soul for anything. "Some men are like that," Emmett said. "Got beat up over something once and spent the rest of their life making sure they never have to explain themselves twice." Judith asked what he meant. Emmett turned his good ear toward the stove and said the fire needed feeding, which was how he answered a question he had already decided he should not have started. She let it go, but she carried it home. There was a telegraph office on the other side of the livery's north wall, and the wall was 1 board thick. She had known that from the first Saturday. What she had not counted on was that after 7 or 8 weeks of sitting under that window with a round knife in her hand, her body would start doing what it used to do without asking her first. The key went on the other side of the boards, faint, the way a cricket is faint, and her left hand, resting on the bench, would come up onto its fingertips and tap along. 2 seasons of it, when she was young and there had still been money, sitting relay at a desk with a green shade over the lamp and a pot of tea going cold at her elbow, cattle prices, deaths, a man in Fort Worth asking a man in Amarillo to please, for the love of God, send the number again. She had been fast. Faster than the men on either side of her, and she had known it, and it was the last thing in her life she had been openly, uncomplicatedly good at. And then the grass burned, and the money went, and there was no more use for a girl who could take 30 words a minute out of the air. She had not told a living soul in Marrow's Bend. It belonged to another woman entirely, one with soft hands. The 10th Saturday, the key ran a long string through the wall, and her hand went with it, and she looked up, and Angus Broderick was watching her fingers on the bench. Not her face, her hand. He did not ask. He looked back down at the coffee and said the wind was going around to the north, and that was all. Another small thing she noticed. He had a way of letting a thing sit in the room unmentioned, and it never once felt like he had failed to notice it. It felt like he was holding a door open and letting her decide whether to walk through. She did not walk through, not that day. The 11th Saturday it was 20 degrees at noon, and the paper on the harness bench would not stay put. He was unrolling something at the far end of the bench, a sheet of drawing paper gone soft at the folds, and he set his coffee cup on one corner and a horseshoe on the other, and while he was reading it she saw more of it than she meant to. Ink lines ruled. A profile of a ditch with the grade written in, a gate assembly of some kind, drawn twice, once whole and once in section, with numbers running down the side in a small square hand. Along the bottom, in the printed line where a form asks a question, a word she read upside down and did not immediately trust. Patent. There was an envelope with it, opened, postmarked from somewhere east, and addressed to him in a clerk's careful hand. He folded it all up in about 4 seconds and put it in his coat. She said nothing. She rebuilt the throat latch she was working on and did not look up again. And it was Emmett who said it, later, sweeping with his back to her. Half the ditches in this county run on that man's notion, Emmett said. Water gates. Something about how you set the fall. Fellows over at Yarborough's pay him something in every year for the use of it, and he don't ever say a word about it to anybody. Judith asked how much something was. Emmett said he had no earthly idea, and that it was none of his business, and that he had never once seen Angus Broderick buy himself a new coat. Then he went back to sweeping, and she sat with a punch in her hand and thought about a man who waited an hour in a cold barn to pay 80 cents for a 60-cent cheek piece. The 12th Saturday, he did not come. She got there at 7. She set the fire. She took the coffee Emmett handed her. She laid her tools out. 9:30 went by. 10. 11. The third stall stayed empty. She did not ask Emmett about it. She would not have been able to ask it in a voice she was willing to hear come out of her own mouth. She finished a hamestrap that nobody had ordered, and she took $1 for the morning instead of 2, and she drove home into a wind that had teeth in it. That was the night she admitted it to herself, out loud, alone, in a kitchen with one lamp lit. Not the whole of it. just the edge. She said, "I am going to have to be careful." The 13th Saturday at 9:30, the gray gelding came down the aisle. He had a saddle skirt with a torn lace, and he was 2 shades whiter around the eyes than a man ought to be in December, and he said, before she asked, that he had been 11 miles the other way with a mare down and a foal turned wrong, and had not slept Friday. She said the skirt would take an hour. He said he'd wait. She handed him the coffee herself that day. He took the cup, and their fingers came so close that she felt the warmth off the back of his hand, and neither of them moved for the length of one breath. And then the cup was in his hand, and hers was empty, and the whole thing had taken 2 seconds. Almost. Nobody in that barn said one word about it. Another small thing she noticed, driving out at noon with $2 in her pocket, and the cold coming down out of the north like a lid. For 13 Saturdays, a man had paid her too much for work she was good at, and had never once told her she needed help. No pity, no offer, just leather on the bench every week until she had a winter's feed money and had earned every cent of it herself. The talk started at church, which is where Talk in Marrow's Bend was baptized before it went out to work. It did not start with her name. It started with a number. Somebody had done arithmetic. $1 a day on a Saturday is $52 in a year, and a woman with 40 head and a note at the bank does not carry a winter on $52, and yet Judith Osborne's stock had come through January with their ribs covered. So the arithmetic went looking for the rest of the money. The first week of January, she came out of the service and heard a voice behind her, pitched exactly right, pitched to carry to her and no farther. "Well, somebody's paying for that hay." She did not turn around. She had learned a long time ago that turning around is how you agree to it. By the second week, it had a shape. By the third, it had a phrase, and the phrase traveled the way phrases do, church to mercantile to the bench outside the barber shop, and the phrase was that Judith Osborne was being kept, not accused of anything. That was the craft of it. Nobody said one plain sentence a person could stand up and answer. They said, "Isn't it a mercy she found work?" They said, "And him out there all this time and never a word to anybody, and now this." They said it kindly. They said it with their heads tipped. The Yarborough women still moved their skirts for her, but one of them, the younger, asked whether the livery paid by the piece or by the day, and Judith said by the day, and the woman said, "Oh, by the day," and let it sit there like a coin she had decided not to pick up. And in the second pew, gloves folded, Ida Weatherby turned partway around after the last hymn and said, so that 11 people heard it, and not one of them could have called it unkind, "I'm glad of it for you, Judith." A woman alone has to take what's offered. What's offered? 2 words, and they did the work of a paragraph. Judith said thank you. She said it evenly. She walked out into the cold with her hands in her sleeves and her cuffs buttoned and her chin where it belonged, and she got up on the wagon seat and drove 9 miles home. And she did not cry until she had the horse unhitched and put up, because the horse had not done anything wrong. The notice came on a Tuesday. A young man from the bank brought it out himself, which she should have understood as the whole message. He had a leather case, and he would not sit down, and he would not take coffee. The note against the water filing, he said, had been reviewed. There was an addendum. The principal was not what she had believed it was. It was twice what she had believed it was, and the interest had been running on the larger figure since the last summer of her husband's life, and the bank would want to discuss terms before spring. Judith read it at the kitchen table with the lamp pulled close. Her husband's signature was at the bottom of the addendum. It was his name. It was not his hand. He wrote a low, tired, leftward hand that dragged the tail of the O, and never once in his life closed the loop on a J, and the name on that page stood up straight and closed everything it started. The ink was blacker than the ink above it. The paper was whiter. She held it to the lamp and saw a watermark that had no business being on a document from that summer. She said none of this to the young man from the bank. She said she would want a copy. He said the copy was hers to keep, which was, when she thought about it later, an oddly generous thing for a man to say about a forgery, and she came to understand that he did not know. He was carrying a case and a list and doing what he was told, and there was a kind of nuance in that she would remember later, when the room filled up and people had to choose. She put the addendum in the tin box under the tackroom floor with the oilcloth, and she went out at 4 the next morning and split wood for 2 hours in the dark. Ida Weatherby opened the second drawer that same week. She looked in at the filing, the survey, the marker description off the east line. Everything in order. Everything as Judith Osborne had laid it out on the last Sunday in September. The reappointment was in the spring. So was the water. She closed the drawer with 2 fingers. The surveyors came in the thaw. Judith saw them from the ridge with the axe still in her hand at 6 in the morning. 3 men and a tripod down in the dry creek bed on her east line, driving stakes with white rag on them. She rode down. They were civil. They were also finished, more or less, and one of them said they were shooting the grade for a party that held a prior description on the water, and did she happen to know the recorder's office hours? She knew the recorder's office hours. She rode into town that same day, and Ida Weatherby was at her window, and Ida said what she had said in September and in November and in December in the same warm voice, with her hands folded. "It won't be long." Then, gently, the way you hand someone a coat. "There's been talk, Judith, about where your money comes from. I don't repeat talk. But if a claim of yours came up before the board with that attached to it, I couldn't help you. You do see that. Judith saw that." She went to the livery afterward because her hands were shaking, and the livery was the one building in that town where nobody asked. Emmett Sparrow had the forge going. He looked at her once, and then he looked at the roof beam. "They're saying things about him, too," Emmett said. "Old business, from before he came here. Something he was accused of when he was young and never charged with, and it wasn't true, and it followed him anyway. That's why he don't sit down at tables." Judith asked what he was accused of. "Taking what wasn't his," Emmett said, and he went and fed the fire. She stood there a long while with her coat still buttoned. What she understood arrived all at once, cold and complete. Every Saturday she took his money. The town wrote a sentence, and the sentence had 2 names in it. Hers could not get any worse. His could. 4 years of a man keeping careful daylight between himself and everybody, 4 years of a clean name held by his fingertips, and she was the thing they would use to open the old wound back up. So what did she do? She told Emmett Sparrow she could not come Saturdays anymore. He did not argue. He said the boy who came Thursdays could take the leather, and she said the boy put grain in the wrong bin, and Emmett said he knew it, and neither of them said anything else. On the next Saturday, the gray gelding came down the aisle at 9:30. The bench along the south wall under the window was clean. The round knife was hung up. There were 2 cups on the stove, and one of them stayed full. Judith Osborne was 9 miles west, up to her wrists in ice water, working the trough. Not because she doubted him, and not because she was ashamed, but because she had finally found the one thing in Marrow's Bend she could still protect, and it was not the ranch. The storm came out of the north on a Tuesday in April, which on that flat means nothing at all until it means everything. The sky went the color of a dirty nickel. The temperature fell 30 degrees in less than an hour, and the wind that had been at her back all morning turned around and came at her face, carrying ice the size of grain. She had 40 head out on the open. She got 31 of them down into the breaks below the house, before the snow went sideways. The last 9 had drifted east, toward the dry creek, and she went after them on foot because the mare would not face into it, and she lost the fence line twice, and the second time she stood still in the white, with her arm over her eyes, and understood, calmly, the way you understand a sum, that a person could die 400 yards from her own kitchen. That was when the gray gelding came out of the storm at a walk. He did not shout anything at her. He rode past her, upwind, and put the gelding broadside so the wind broke on the horse instead of on her. And then he pointed with 2 fingers at the ground where the fence was, and she found it. They got the 9 head. It took an hour and a half. He worked the outside and she worked the inside, and neither of them said one word the whole time, because there was no hearing anything, and because there was nothing to say that the work was not already saying. When the barn door was shut and barred behind them, her hands would not open. She had to set them flat against the wall of the stall and wait for the fingers to unlock, and she felt the ice crack out of her sleeves and drop on the floor. Behind his saddle there was a bundle tied in canvas, the size of a hay bale, snow packed white into every crease of the rope. He had been in town when the wind went around. He had been standing at the mercantile counter with a receipt in his hand, and he had turned around and looked at the window, and then he had bought what they had on the shelf, and then he had ridden 9 miles into it. She did not learn that from him. She learned it 3 weeks later, from a clerk, in a room full of people. The kitchen was 40 degrees, and it felt like a bath. She got the stove going and stood over it with her coat still on. He stood inside the door and did not sit, and she thought, with something that in a warmer month might have been amusement, that he had ridden 9 miles through a blizzard for her and would still not sit down in her house. Then he put the bundle on the table and cut the rope with his knife. Gray wool, folded, new, the mercantile's paper band still around each one. He squared them up as he went, the way a man stacks something he intends to be counted. Judith counted them. 12, he said. It's what they had. She put her hands down on the table beside the stack because she did not know where else to put them, and there they were in the lamplight, both of them split across the knuckles, black at the seams with oil that would not wash out. One place on the right hand still open and shining. She did not hide them. She was too tired. That was all it was, and it turned out to be the most honest thing she did that year. He looked at the hands. He did not look away from them, and he did not soften his face about it. You've been doing this alone since June, he said. Since April, she said. He took his hat off. He had not done that inside a building in 4 years. Not at the livery, not at church, not once that anybody in Marrow's Bend could name, and he did it in her kitchen and set the hat crown down on the corner of the table, and his hair was flat and gray at the temples, and he looked, for the first time since she had known, his outline in a barn aisle, like a man in a room rather than a man passing through one. I've got a spare room, he said. You don't have to earn it first. The wind hit the north wall of the house, and the lamp flame stood over and came back. She said, People are already saying it. I know what they're saying, he said. They'll say worse. They said worse than that about me when I was 19, he said. Said I took a saddle and $100 out of a man's barn in Palo Pinto County. Never charged me. Wasn't true. It followed me anyway, 4 counties and 11 years of it. He said it the way another man might report the price of oats. So I know exactly what it's worth, he said, which is why I'd like you to have somewhere to go that doesn't cost you anything. And then she told him. She had not planned to, not that night, not ever. But her hands were on the table, and the lie of being a woman who managed had already come apart in front of him out there in the snow. And once a thing like that is down, you find you cannot be bothered to hold up the rest. She said, I have not always been this. She told him about the desk with the green shade over the lamp, and the pot of tea going cold at her elbow, and 2 seasons of sitting relay when she was young, and her family still had money, cattle prices, deaths in other towns, a man in Fort Worth begging a man in Amarillo to send the number 1 more time. She told him she could take 30 words a minute out of the air, and that she had been faster than the men on either side of her, and that she had known it and had liked knowing it. Then the grass burned, she said. 4,000 acres, the house, the barns, and there is no use anywhere on this earth for a girl who can hear code. So I married a good man with a water claim, and I have been pretending ever since that this, and she turned one hand over on the table, is what I always was. He listened all the way to the end of it without once helping her along. You tapped it on my bench, he said. 10 weeks back, whole string of it left hand while you were setting a keeper. You saw that. I've been watching your hands since September, he said. Then he picked up the top blanket off the stack, shook it out, and put it over the back of the chair by the stove, and that was the entire ceremony he was willing to hold over the confession of her life. She said, You don't think less of it. Being good at a thing nobody needs. Somebody needs it, he said, and you didn't lose it. You've had it the whole time. You just carried it 15 years without a wire to put it on. Then at the door with his hat back on, I hold a patent on a water gate. Half the ditches in this county run on it, and I get paid every spring for it, and I have never once had anyone to tell about it. So I'd rather you were something than nothing. I'd rather it was more than what they think it is, not less. They hung the blankets in the barn at 2 a.m, over the north window where the boards had shrunk, doubled on the mare and on the 2 youngest. One over the tack room door where the tin box lay under the floor, though he did not know that, or if he knew it, he did not say. He slept in the barn. He would not take the room. She lay awake in the house and listened to the storm go out of the country the way a train goes out of a town. It was not a promise or a proposal, just 12 blankets and a spare room offered to a woman with her hands on the table in plain sight. At first light she went out, and the world was white and blue and absolutely still, and there was a sound she had never heard on that place in the whole 4 years she had owned it. Water. Down on the east line, in the dry creek bed that only ran in spring, in among the surveyor's stakes with the white rag on them, the creek was running, full, loud, cutting a black channel through the snow. They stood on the ridge and looked at it, the 2 of them, and Angus Broderick said, Quiet. That was the thing everybody wanted. Another small thing she noticed. He was not looking at the water. He was looking at the stakes. She went back to the livery on the first Saturday in May, and not for the money. She went because Emmett Sparrow sent word out with a hay hauler that the boy who came Thursdays had put a rivet through the wrong side of a britchen, and a horse had gone down in the road because of it, and because Emmett had phrased it, as he phrased everything, as his own problem and not hers. By then the talk had already begun to turn, and it had not turned because of anything she said. It turned because on the morning after the storm, she had loaded 4 of the 12 blankets into the wagon and driven them 6 miles north to the hide place, where the roof had come off the lean-to, and there was a child in the house with a bad chest. She did not stay. She did not explain where the blankets came from. Cora Hyde told her sister, and her sister told the mercantile, and Orrin Pike, who clerked there, said out loud over the counter that he knew exactly where those blankets came from because he had sold every one of them to a man in a hurry. That was the first crack in it. It ran a long way in 3 weeks. The Yarborough women moved their skirts for her at church, and the younger one, this time, asked nothing at all about how the livery paid. Emmett Sparrow told anybody who came in that Judith Osborne set a better keeper than he did, and he was 60 years old. And Ida Weatherby, in the second pew, said what she always said in her warm voice about a woman alone taking what was offered. And for the first time nobody picked it up and carried it anywhere. The wire came through the north wall on the second Saturday in May at 11:20. She had her hand flat on the bench with a punch in her fingers, and she was not listening, which is when a person hears best. The key ran, and her hand came up on its fingertips out of pure habit, and then it stopped, because the string coming through those boards was not cattle prices. It was going out, not coming in. It was going out from the bank's own clerk. And it was in a private cipher, the kind of 5-letter grouping she had taken 400 times at a desk, with a green shade over the lamp, and whoever had built it lazily on straight numbers under the letters, the way men build a code when they are certain no woman on the other side of a barn wall can read it. She took it down on the back of a feed bill with a carpenter's pencil. She took the reply at 10 minutes to noon. Then she sat there in the cold with 2 pieces of paper in front of her, while Emmett swept, and read what she had. The first wire told a party east of them that the Osborne filing was still unrecorded and would remain unrecorded through the spring board meeting. The second wire, the reply, instructed the bank to proceed on the addendum and to have the prior description entered under the name of a land company Judith had never heard of, and it was signed with 3 letters that meant nothing to her. But she knew who had sent it, because a code only hides names from people who cannot read it. She did not go to Ida Weatherby. She did not go to the bank. She drove 9 miles home, and she got the tin box out from under the tack room floor, and then she drove into town on Monday and knocked on the door of a house at the end of the street where Alvy Pruitt lived, 71 years old, notary for this county for 31 years before Ida Weatherby ever held the post. Alvy Pruitt still kept his own register. Old notaries do. He had every instrument he ever witnessed entered in his own hand, dated in a set of black books on a shelf over his stove. The hearing was set for a Thursday in the courthouse because the judge came through on Thursdays. The room filled. That was the part she had not counted on. Emmett Sparrow came and sat with his good ear toward the front. Orrin Pike came in his apron. Both Yarborough women came and sat 1 row behind her. Cora Hyde came. A dozen more came who had spent January saying that somebody was paying for that hay, and they came, most of them, because they had begun to suspect they had been used to say it. Angus Broderick stood at the back with his hat in his hand. The judge asked Judith Osborne what she was asking for. She said she was asking for 2 things: that her filing be recorded as of the day she brought it in, and that the addendum against her water be read alongside the original note. The bank's president, Mr. Crane, said pleasantly that the addendum was in order and had been reviewed. Then Alvy Pruitt opened his book. He laid the original note on the table, the one her husband had signed in the last summer of his life, and beside it, the addendum the young man from the bank had carried out to her kitchen in his leather case. He turned them both toward the room. He did not make a speech about it. He was 71, and he had been doing this before most of them were born. "Look at the O," he said, "and look at the J." They leaned in. That is the whole of it. 14 people got up out of their chairs and came forward and looked for themselves, and what they saw was a low, tired, leftward hand that dragged the tail of the O and never closed the loop on a J, and beside it a name standing straight up and closing everything it started. The ink on one was black, and the ink on the other was faded brown. The paper on one was yellow, and the paper on the other was white, and Alvy Pruitt held that white sheet up to the courthouse window, and the watermark showed through it plain, a mill mark that no paper made in this county had carried until 2 years ago. Nobody had to be told what they were looking at. Lewis Tate, the young man from the bank, was called. He said he had carried the case and the list and had not read what was in the case. He said it in a voice that went thin in the middle. Then he said that the addendum had been given to him already sealed, and by whom? And he sat down and looked at his hands, and Judith found she could not hold 1 minute of it against him. Then the judge asked how Mrs. Osborne came to know there was a land company involved at all, so she stood up and said it plainly, once. "I worked a telegraph key for 2 seasons," she said. "I can take 30 words a minute. There is one board between the livery bench and the telegraph office, and on the 10th of May at 20 past 11, the bank sent a wire in cipher, and at 10 minutes to noon it took a reply, and I wrote both of them down." She put the feed bill and her transcript on the table beside the 2 documents. The room did not gasp. It went quiet in the way a church goes quiet, and Emmett Sparrow said to nobody, "Well, I'll be," and that was the loudest thing anybody said. Ida Weatherby was asked when the filing came into her office. She said she would have to consult her record. Alvy Pruitt said he had consulted his, and he read out the date, the last Sunday in September, and the survey number, and the East Line marker description, and closed the book. Judith Osborne was invited to say what she wanted done about it. What she did not do was this. She did not turn around in that room and look at the woman in gray with her gloves folded. She had earned the right to. She had 100 sentences in her, 7 months of them, and every one of them would have landed. She said, "I want my filing recorded. That is all I came for." The judge ordered it recorded as of the day it was brought in. He ordered the addendum struck and the note restored to its true principle, and he referred the matter of the land company to the district. And that was the end of the business, in about 40 minutes, without one raised voice. Ida Weatherby kept her office. She was reappointed in June on a vote nobody bothered to attend. But something had come loose in the fittings of her, and it never went back. She still sat at the window on the street. She still said, at church, that she was glad of it for Judith, and people said yes, wasn't it, and moved on to the price of wire. She had spent years being the one who knew things first, and lived out the rest of it in a town that had quietly stopped asking her. Nobody punished her. Nobody cared to. Judith walked out into the white noon light on the boardwalk, in the same spot where she had stood in September and felt the sensation of having handed a thing over. Angus Broderick came out behind her and put his hat on. He said, 30 words a minute. She said, "I told you I was fast." "You told me," he said. "You did not tell me you were going to do it in front of the judge. You said you'd rather I was something than nothing." And then he smiled. Not the flicker she had caught twice in 8 months at the edge of a coffee cup. The whole thing, right there on the courthouse steps, in front of everybody, a weathered, guarded face come all the way open, and given to her, and nobody else in that town ever did get to see it. "I've got a spare room," he said. "Offer stands. You still don't have to earn it first." She told him she was aware. She told him she had known that since a barn in April. She said she was going to keep splitting her own wood anyway, and he said he had assumed as much, and he walked her down to the wagon and did not touch her arm, and the creek on the east line was still running. I think about the chapel outside Abilene sometimes. Walls up, roof gone, pews facing an altar with nothing over it but sky. I used to believe that was me. It took a man buying 12 blankets in a storm and a notary's black book and one board between a bench and a telegraph key to teach me the difference. A thing can lose everything that made it what it was and still be standing, and a thing standing can be roofed again. If this story meant something to you, drop a comment and tell me which part hit you the hardest. It genuinely means something to know this reached the right person. If you are new here, subscribe and turn on notifications, and I promise the next story will be even harder to walk away from. Thank you for staying until the very end. I will see you in the next one. The creek ran 41 days that spring, and then it quit, the way it always had, and for the first time in 4 years she was not afraid of the sound of it stopping. Her filing was in the book. The note was the size it had always truly been. She still got up at 4. That never changed. 2 hours on the block, 1 hour on the hall, the ricks laid along the north wall. What Angus Broderick did about it, in June, was buy a second axe and leave it in her barn with a wedge and a file and no word at all. After that, on Saturdays, he worked the far side of the block, and she worked the near one, and they put up a cord without speaking and drank coffee with the barn door open. In October, he came in for supper. He stood inside the door, the way he always stood, and she set 2 plates down anyway, and he looked at the second chair for about 3 seconds, and then he pulled it out and sat in it. He hung his hat on the peg first. Nobody made anything of it. She passed the bread. That was all that happened, and she thought about it for a week. They were married in April at the church on a Tuesday with 9 people in the pews, and Emmett Sparrow standing up with his good ear toward the front. Ida Weatherby was not asked, and did not come, and mentioned to 2 women afterward that she was glad of it for Judith, and both of them said yes, wasn't it, and asked her about the weather. Judith moved 4 boxes and a tin wrapped in oilcloth. She kept her own place, her own brand, her own 40 head. She had not sold anything to anybody. The spare room was on the west side of the house, and he had cleaned it out before she ever saw it. A desk under the window, a chair. On the desk, a lamp with a green shade over it, the exact green, the green of a room she had sat in when she was young, and there was still money. And bolted to the wall above the desk, on a walnut base, a used key and sounder, the brass rubbed dull by somebody else's hand for years before it ever came to hers. He had run the wire himself. 9 miles of it, west to his place and back, around by the horse pasture, strung on cedar posts he had set in the frost that winter while she was asleep at 3 in the morning on the other side of the flat. The telegraph man in Marrow's Bend had laughed at him, then sold him the set. Judith put her hand on the key and did not press it. Then he went out and down the road, and she sat in the chair in the green light with her split, oiled, heeled-over hands in her lap, and at 11:20, the sounder began to tick. She took it clean, first time, at 30 words a minute. I have got a spare room. Offer stands. You still do not have to earn it. She sent back 4 letters, and then she went out onto the porch to wait for him. And when the gray gelding came up over the rise, he already had it on his face, all the way open, the thing nobody else in that county ever got to see. When I think about them, I do not think about the courthouse. I think about a man setting cedar posts in frozen ground at 3 in the morning, 9 miles of them, so a woman who had spent 15 years being no use to anybody would have somewhere to put her hands. If this story stayed with you, tell me where you're listening from and what moment touched you most. Drop a comment. It genuinely means something to know this reached the right person. If you'd like more quiet evenings by the fire, lonely roads, quiet cowboys, and hearts finding their way home, come back for the next one. Subscribe and turn on notifications, and thank you for staying until the very end.